In this lesson, we're going to be looking at state, and this is going to be a very interesting lesson, so stay with me. The reason why this is going to be an interesting lesson is because state is one of the fundamentals of React components, and you're going to be using them a lot. We'll be continuing with the project that we have built so far. So the first thing I want to do is run my development server npm run dev. Now, when we talk about state of components, you can think of state in two ways. The first way you can look at state is the information or the properties available in a component at a time. So when you say what is the state of that component, it means what is the current information or properties available in that component. Another way you can look at state of a component is the memory of that component. At a particular time in that component, certain information or certain variables had a specific value, and then at another point in that component has new set of information, and that is stored in the memory of that component. Now, state is something that is available in React as well as many other frameworks, but before all these frameworks existed, you had state even in your normal HTML element. And let me show you an example. So coming here to the index.html file, which if you remember is the root file, I'm just going to clear all of this code I used in previous lessons. I'm going to take this off, and let's just say I comment this div with an ID of root. So this is currently blank because that's where React populates all our components. Now let's say we had an input with a type of checkbox. And where is our checkbox? Our checkbox is somewhere here. So let me zoom in so you can see it. Now we have this element, which you can also think of as a component. And when I click on this checkbox, it becomes checked. Now this is the idea of state. By default, if I should refresh, this component or element has an unchecked state. But then when I interact with it by clicking on it, it now has a checked state, which is also stored in the memory of this element. And if I should click on it again, it now becomes unchecked. The state has changed. And this is not only for checkboxes. Even in your normal input, you also have state. Look at this input. It's currently in an empty state. Now, if I should type my name, Dillion, or Deeecode, as you probably know me as, this input now has a state where the value is Deeecode, which would also be stored in the memory of this element. So I want you to keep this idea of state in mind as we now go to React components. So let me bring back this div and remove this input. So now let's go to app.jsx. Remember in the conditional rendering lesson, we have this variable show pricing cards, which is true. And then down here, we say that if show pricing cards is true, render this. But then if we change show pricing cards to false, then the pricing cards would not be rendered. Now this is not how you manage state in React components, because here we are manually changing the value to true or to false. And before I show you how to actually manage state in a React component, let me show you why regular variables like this cannot be used as state. So let's say we made this let show pricing cards equals true. I'm using let because I want to change the value of this variable. Then let's say we had a function which we're going to call update state. When you call this function, what it's going to do is that it's going to update show pricing cards to false. Now where are we going to call this function? Let's say before this show pricing cards, we had the button update state. This is the button here. It's pretty small, but let's make do with that. Now, if you remember when we talked about events and event handlers, for this button, I can listen to the click event and then I can pass my update state function. So when you click on this button, it's going to call this function. When it calls this function, this is going to update the variable to false. Now, if I should click on update state, the variable is now false, but then you see that this pricing cards are still showing. But in our conditional rendering here, we say that when the show pricing cards is false, then this should not be rendered, but it is still rendered. Now, this example shows you why you cannot use regular variables for state. And the reason for that is when you update variables, React would not render the component again. So the first time show pricing cards is true, React is going to render all of this here. But then when you update the variable to false, React is not going to re-render this. If React re-rendered this, then this place will not be included in the render. And I'm going to show you how you can actually manage state in a React component. Before I proceed, I also want to let you know that the way you manage state in a functional component is different from the way you manage state in a class component. The idea is still the same, but the syntax is different. But in future lessons, when we look at class components, I'll show you how to also do state with class components. So how do we create or manage state in functional components? This is what we're going to use one React hook called useState. There are many more React hooks, and we're going to look at them in later lessons. But here I can import useState from React. And then let me comment this part here. Let's just say I have const results, and then I can call useState, and the value that useState would receive is the first state, the default state. So in this case, I can pass a default state of true. Let me call this state. I don't know why I called it result. Now, useState is going to return an array, and in that array, you have two values. The first value is going to be the current state. So I can assign that first value to a variable called show pricing cards. This is going to be state. I'm using an index of 0 for the first value returned in that array. Then it's going to return a second value, and that second value is a function which you can use to update the state. So I'm going to assign that function to set state. This is going to be state with an index of 1, which is the second value. In this update state function, instead of updating this variable to false, we could use let here, but like I showed you, using variables is not going to work. So let me just keep that at const. Now, when you call update state, what I'm now going to do is call this function set state, and then I can pass the new state that I want for my component. So in that case, I'm going to pass false. The default is true, but then when you call this function, it's going to call this passing a value of false. Now let's see what happens. If we come back here, when I click on update state, what do you notice? You see that those pricing cards are no longer rendered. That's because show pricing cards is now false, and because show pricing cards is false, this part here is not going to be rendered. So what makes state different from regular variables in this case? Well, with regular variables, when you change the value of those variables, as you noticed, pricing cards were still showing, and that's because React doesn't use the new information to render that component. But in a case where you use state and you also use this state changing function passing a new value, what React is now going to do is that React is going to render this component again, but this time while rendering the component, show pricing cards is going to have access to the new state, which is now going to be false. So the first time, show pricing cards is going to have true because that's the default state. But then when you call set state with false, then React is going to render this component again, which is re-rendering. If you remember from the previous lesson, I talked about how re-rendering is a case where React renders the component again. But while re-rendering, this component is now going to have new information. So in this new rendering phase, show pricing cards is now going to be false, and that is why this part is not rendered. Now, state can be as basic as this, but there are a couple of things you need to pay attention to when working with React state. One thing you also need to know when it comes to working with state in React components is the convention of state. Now, here we have show pricing cards, and then here we have set state. But this is not how you would see it often. Instead of having set state, what you would want to have here is set show pricing cards. So this is a convention when working with React state where you have the name of the state, and then the function that is going to update that state, you're going to have set, and then you have the name of the state. So in this case, S is small letter, but here S is capital letter. That's the only difference. So if you have a state like checked, then the function that is going to update that checked state is going to be called set checked. So this is the convention, and this is what I'm going to be using for the rest of this course. But like I said, you can call this function whatever you want to call it. Another thing is when working with state, you would often not see it used like this, where you have const state equals useState, blah blah blah, and then you get the first value in the array, then you get the second value in the returned array. What people often do here is array destructuring. If you want to learn more about array destructuring, I'll link a video in the description. You can check it out. But with array destructuring, I'm going to come here. Let me make this bigger so that you're not distracted by what's happening here. Since we know that this is going to return an array, we can destructure that array. So here we have the array. Therefore, the first value of that array, I can call it show pricing cards, and then for the second value of that array, I can have set show pricing cards. This is the same thing as what we had earlier where we were using index 0, index 1, but this is a much simpler way to write it because now you see I'm using just one line, and now I can use set show pricing cards here. Again, when you click on this button, it calls update state, and when it calls update state is going to call set show pricing cards and pass a value of false. And by doing this will cause a re-render, and in that re-render, React is now going to use the new state, and because it is using that new state and that new state now has show pricing cards as false, this would not be rendered. So let's try this again. If I click on update state, because it is now false, that is no longer rendered. Now let's say I come to this update state, and instead of passing false, I'm going to negate show pricing cards. Negate show pricing cards means if show pricing cards is false, by negating it, it is now going to be true. So show pricing cards will be true. And if show pricing cards is true, by negating that true, it is now going to be false. So let's do it like this. Now if I should start afresh, currently show pricing cards is true. So if I call this function, it means it's going to do set show pricing cards false. And if I click it now, it's false. That part is not included in the render. But because it is false now, if I should click this button again, it is going to call update state, and we're going to call set show pricing cards. And because it is false, by negating that false, it is now going to be true. So our new state is going to be true. And now if I should click on this again, it's now true. This part is included in the render. Now let's come back here to look more at state. Your state can be of any values. Here we've used a boolean, but you can have a state of a string like Deeecode. You can have a state like 50, a number. You can even have a state which is an array. Although when it comes to arrays or even objects, there are a few things you want to take note of. We're going to look at that soon. So here, instead of doing show pricing cards, set show pricing cards, I can do state, and then here do set state. In this object, I can pass show pricing cards with a value of true. And then here, when you call update state, this is now going to call set state. I'm now going to pass an object with show pricing cards, and then I'm going to negate the previous state.show pricing cards. I hope this is easier to understand and it hasn't gotten too complex yet. Again, my default state is an object, and then when I want to update that state, I pass an object to, because if I pass a string here, it means this string is going to become the new state. But I can also update the state with an object, and in that object I have a key show pricing cards, and that is now going to have a value which is negated the current state dot show pricing cards. So this is still going to cause the same effect. No, it will not cause the same effect because there is something missing. So here, instead of using show pricing cards like this, I'm now going to use state dot show pricing cards, because state is an object and this is a property in that object. And now if I come here, it's still going to have the same effect. I have update state. The state object has show pricing cards as false, it doesn't show. And now if I click it again, it has true, it now shows. So in your state, you can use normal primitive values like strings or numbers, or you can use objects and even arrays. Now, like I said, when you update the state of a component, it causes a re-render, which is going to contain the new information available in that component's memory or that component's state. But what I also want you to know is that this is not the only part that is going to be re-rendered. Also, everything you have in this function is going to be recreated. So you can think of it as when you update the state of this app component, it's like this app component will be executed again, but with the new information available. And the reason why I'm telling you this is, let's say over here we have a console log that says I am rendered, and then we open the console here. So if I refresh for the first time, we have I am rendered. Don't worry if you are seeing this twice. I already mentioned this previously that I'm going to explain later on why we are saying it twice, but just assume we are seeing only one. The other one is grayed out. Now if I should update the states, you can see that we have this logged again. So what is happening here is when you update the state, from the beginning here, everything is going to be run again. This will be run again. This is now going to have access to the new state, not this default state. This is also going to be run again. That means this function will be recreated. This part is going to be run again. This cards array that we created is going to be recreated, and then what we return here is now going to be rendered again, of course, with the new state information available for that render. Now this is very important to know because in some cases there are certain things that you may not want to run again, and React provides a solution for that. So there are some things that might be expensive to run again, which if you are running it every time state is updated, it might affect the performance of your application. As we progress in this course, we'll get to those things and we'll see how we can avoid some of those recreation and re-rendering. But I just want you to know now that when you update a state, it's almost like you are executing that function again. And when a state changes, the component is re-rendered, right? And because the component is re-rendered, everything in the component, including nested components, that would also be re-rendered. So this div here would be re-rendered, this button will be re-rendered. This part in this case would not be re-rendered because show pricing cards is false. But if show pricing cards becomes true, if I click on update state, it means everything here is going to be re-rendered, and that also means this nested component here, pricing card, would be re-rendered. Even though pricing card is a component on its own, because it is a child of this app component, that means it is going to be re-rendered. Here we're managing state in the app component, but I can also come to the pricing card component to manage state. And that means also in this button component, I can come here to manage state. So you can manage state in any component, but what you should know is that, for example, in this pricing card component, when you change the state, everything in this pricing card component is going to be re-rendered. And because this button is inside this pricing card component, that would also be re-rendered. If a state in the pricing card component changes, it's not going to affect the app component. Why? Because the app component is not a child of the pricing card component. So there are certain cases where if you don't want certain components to be re-rendered, you would want to put that state in a different location where it's not going to affect those components. Don't worry, as we progress in this course, we'll see some of these examples, but just keep this in mind. When you update state in a component, that component is going to re-render everything here. There are a few cases where it might not, but again, we're going to look at that in future lessons. Another thing I want to show you with state is how does React compare state changes? And for me to show you that, let's say I go back to a Boolean, and here we have state to be true. Let me comment this part for now, and then here I do set state as false. I'm just going to quickly come down here and just call this state. I know it's supposed to be called show pricing cards, but let's just keep it as state since we have state here and it has a value like true. Now when we click on this update state, this is going to change the value of the true to false. As you know, in JavaScript, false is not equal to true. So because React now says that this is a new state which is not equal to the previous state, this is going to cause a re-render. So now if I should click on update state, this causes a re-render. Let me also open the console so that you can see this. Let's try it again from the beginning. If you click on update state, it causes a re-render. So this line runs again and we have I am rendered. But now let's say here we have set states of true. The default state is true, but when you call this function, we are updating the state again to true. In this case, true is actually equal to true. And because true is equal to true, React is not going to re-render that component. And we can check this out. Let me refresh. So here we have I am rendered, which is run the first time in the first render. If I click on update state, you see that nothing is happening. This line doesn't run again. Why is that the case? Well, I already explained that. Because true is equal to true, React feels like this is the same information. There is no need for me to run this component again, because if this is the same information, it means everything is still going to happen the way it is happening already. So if this is a string of Deeecode and I also change this to a string of Deeecode, this is still going to be the same thing because Deeecode is equal to Deeecode. And if this is also a number like 50, let me close this because something is happening in the console which might be confusing. But because we are updating the state to 50, 50 is equal to 50. So React is like, this is not new. I'm not going to run a re-render. If you want me to run a re-render, then pass a new value, which is different from the current value. So you can see how the React useState hook compares the state before it decides whether it wants to render the component again. But when it comes to objects, things can be a bit tricky. Let me explain. Now let me go back to what we had before. We had show pricing cards of true, and then I can come here and uncomment this part again. Here I can do state.show pricing cards. So let's use a value like false. So by default, this state object has a property of show pricing cards with true, and then here we update that state passing an object show pricing cards property with a value of false. Now in this case, before React triggers a re-render, it's going to do its comparison again, right? It's going to say, is this object show pricing cards with true equal to show pricing cards false? Now in this case, you'd look at it like it is not equal, right? Because this property has true and this property has false. Well, let's open our console and refresh again, we have the first render. This is logged, console log, I am rendered. If we click on update state, well, this causes a re-render because, well, this new state is not equal to the previous state. Now, what if I change this value to true? Now, you might think that show pricing cards true is equal to show pricing cards 2. This object is equal to this object. And if it is equal, like we already learned, React is not going to trigger a re-render. But watch what React does here. If I click on this, you see we have another render, and that is why this line is run again. Now, why is this run again when this new state is the same as this state? Well, the reason for this is, as you probably already know, objects in JavaScript, even if they have the same structure, they are not equal. So even an empty object is not equal to an empty object. Same thing applies to arrays because they are also under the object type. An empty array is not equal to an empty array, even though they have the same structure and they all have empty values. The reason for this is what is known as reference values in JavaScript. Now, I have a video where I've already gone into detail. I'm going to link it below. I would definitely recommend you check it out. In that video, I explained the concept of primitive values and reference values. But just to give you a quick answer here, the idea is that this array is stored in a path in memory which has a reference. That reference can be ref1. For example, this is not how reference addresses work, but let's just assume it's ref1. This other array is stored in another path in memory, which we can say is ref2. So when you do empty array equals empty array, what you're actually comparing is the references like this. And because this reference is different from this reference, this is going to be false, which means two objects are not equal, even though they have the same structure. Because they're stored in different addresses, they are not equal. I'd recommend you check out that video to learn more in detail about how this works. So this is why when you are updating the state with a similar object, for the fact that this object has a different reference than this object, then this is going to cause a re-render because React is going to say, maybe they have the same structure. I don't know. But what I do know is that the references are different. And because the references are different, React is like, I am going to trigger a re-render of this component. So I just want you to know that because sometimes your component may be re-rendering when you don't expect it to re-render. And this might just be it. You have a reference state somewhere. Now, so far we have been managing just one state, which is show pricing cards. What if you wanted to manage more states? Well, you can choose to put all of that states in the same object. So here we're managing show pricing cards true. Let's say we have another state called show heading, and this is also going to be true. When you call set update state, we can also update show heading to false. Well, instead of doing it like this, let's just use negate. So we're going to negate the current state.show pricing cards, and we're also going to negate the current state.show heading. And then here we can conditionally render the heading. We can say the rendering should only be rendered if show heading is true. Sorry, not show heading, state.show heading, because state is the actual state and then show heading is a property. So here I can put the heading here. By clicking on update state, this is going to set a new state which is going to have show pricing cards as the negated value of the current show pricing cards. Same thing for show heading. So if I click on this, the heading doesn't show and pricing cards doesn't show. But if I click on update state again and it negates the current state from false to true, then both of them show. Now when you want to manage more states, you can choose to put them in an object like this so that you only have one state, which is an object state in this case. So you can choose to put all of them like this, but if the states are not related, then you can create another state using the useState. If show pricing cards and show heading are related, then you can put them here. But in this case, pricing cards doesn't look related with heading. They look like different things. So all we can do here is we can create two states. So we have the first state, which is going to be for show pricing cards. And then following the convention, I'm going to have set show pricing cards. Then we're going to have useState false, or let's start with true. And then here we can have show heading using the same convention. You have set, then you have the name of the state, and this is also going to have a value of true. And then when you call on update state now, you can now say that set set show pricing cards, the negated value of show pricing cards. And then you can have set show heading, negated value of the current state of show heading. And then here, instead of doing state.show heading, we can now use show heading, since show heading is a variable standing by itself. And then here we can say show pricing card, since it's a variable standing by itself. And now we have this. And now if we click on update state, the heading becomes false, show pricing cards becomes false, so they're not visible. Click on it again, they become true. Now this is visible, and the pricing cards are also visible. So you can use the useState function as many times as you want in your component. In this case, we have this function update state, which is updating the two states. But another thing we can do is we can call this update show pricing cards, and here we can have update show heading. And what this will do is manage show heading, and what this will do is manage show pricing cards. Now I can have two buttons. So this first button is going to say update pricing cards or update show pricing cards, and in this case it's going to call update show pricing cards. And then this other button is going to say update show heading, and then here we're going to have update show heading. So now we have two buttons which are currently not really visible. So now this one updates the pricing card state from true to false, back and forth, toggling between them. Then this one updates the heading. You can see the heading going off and coming back. So you don't have to update multiple states in the same function. You can choose to do that in different functions. Again, what you should know is that when you click on update show pricing cards and it updates this to maybe false, everything here is going to be run again with that value of false for the show pricing cards state. Show heading is still going to be true because that state has not been updated yet. This is the only state that has been updated for the current re-render. If you then call update show heading, it's going to trigger another re-render, and in that re-render, show pricing card is going to be false because from the previous re-render it was updated to false. So it's still going to stay as false, and then show heading now is going to be false. So it's important to note this: when you update state and that triggers a re-render, that re-render is going to contain the new state that has been changed from the previous state. Always keep that in mind. A re-render always contains the updated states. There is still a lot to cover when it comes to state in React components, but one more thing I want to show you with states is that they are always isolated to a component instance. And what do I mean by this? Now if we go to main.jsx, where we are using this app component, using this app component here is a component instance of the app component, and you can have multiple instances. Here we have just one instance, but if I should do this again, now we have two instances. This is the first instance from here to here, and this is the second instance from here to here. And when I say that state is isolated to a component instance, it means that when you change the state in this first app component, it's not going to affect the state in this second app component, and vice versa. If you change the state in this instance, it's not going to affect this instance. The state we have created for the app component will be isolated in this instance and isolated in this instance. So let me show you what happens now. Let me extend this. Now if I click on update show pricing cards, the show pricing card state becomes false, right? So it doesn't show for this first instance, but you can see that it is still showing in this second instance. Again, that's because this instance has its own memory and this second instance has its own memory. The memories do not affect one another. If I click on update show heading here, which changes the show heading state to false, see the heading doesn't show here, but the heading is still showing here. And a component instance is not where you created the component. No, a component instance is where you used the component. We used it here. We used it here. We might even choose to use the app component somewhere else. All those instances are not affecting one another when their state changes. And that's about it for this lesson. Like I said, there are still more things to cover when it comes to state of components, but I think this lesson is long enough already. So I'm just going to keep that for the upcoming lessons. Now, as we saw, when state changes, components are re-rendered, right? There are certain times that you don't want some things to be rendered. I think I mentioned this earlier already. Sometimes you don't want some things to be rendered because it can affect the performance of your application. In this case, we are doing very simple things. So even if some things are re-rendered, it doesn't matter. But sometimes you want to avoid that. We're going to look at that in upcoming lessons. I hope this lesson was simple enough and it gives you a good understanding of how state works in components. Another thing to know about state is that they are asynchronous, and that is what we're going to be looking at in the next lesson.